the Skype webinar system, so we hope it works well for you. There is a lot of great functionality that we are excited to be able to share with you today, but bear with us as we try and make this work. So just double checking before I kick off everything. Mark, can you see, and are we good?
Yep, I see you're addressing unconscious bias to create an inclusive system of care webinar screen.
Perfect, fantastic. So my name is Kelsey Leonard. I am the Cultural and Linguistic Competence Coordinator for the Pennsylvania Care Partnership. So that's me, that's my photo, so the ominous voice that you'll be hearing throughout the day today, you can kind of connect it with the face. And you're going to hear a lot today about the acronym CLC, Cultural and Linguistic Competency. And I won't go too much into that, but just if that's your first time seeing it, that's what CLC stands for. So some of our objectives today. We want to try and understand what implicit bias and or unconscious bias, they're oftentimes used interchangeably, means and how it may influence our decisions, especially our decisions when we think about system of care. And that can be implicit bias of youth, implicit bias of families, implicit bias of providers. And then we also want to try and understand that being implicitly biased does not necessarily mean we act in explicitly biased ways. And then we also want to try and learn to recognize some of the behaviors that may suggest bias or differential treatment within system of care. And we want to be able to learn some techniques that help us de-bias perceptions and improve our overall interactions within systems of care. So first off, I'm hoping that we can kind of brainstorm a bit to collectively come to some understanding about what is culture. So if you can, in the chat box, if you can just type in definitions that you think of, how you would respond to answering what is culture. It could be word associations that you have with what is culture. And we'll just take a few minutes to type in some responses. So we've got heritage and upbringing, folklore, history, foods, languages of people, the intangible things that make them who they are. Anyone else want to add? Beliefs and values, fantastic. So those are some core ones. As if more come in, I'm sure Mark can share them with us. But I think that's a great start. All of those things definitely are a part of how we define culture. What is culture? But let's go deeper and add a bit of an introductory exercise to think about who we might identify as some of our cultural groups when we start to think about what is culture. So if you think about what are your cultural groups, groups of people who consciously or unconsciously share identifiable values, norms, symbols, and some ways of living that are repeated and transmitted from one generation to another, how would you identify those groups that are specific to you as an individual? So in this activity, we want to take a few minutes to just kind of place into these imaginary circles, or if you have a paper and a piece of pen near you, you can kind of draw out 5 circles. But what would be 5 identifying cultural groups that really have shaped you and shaped who you are and how you see yourself as an individual in the world? And if you feel confident enough after filling in the 5 circles, and you'd like to share some of those 5 identifiers, or even just one identifier in the chat box, please feel free to type those in. we had some additional definitions for how to define culture, lifestyle, and general norms, practices of a group. And then I feel like someone also put in some identifiers that they believe were family, religious group, community. So as people are still filling in the circles, if you feel bold enough, we'd love to see what your identifiers would be. For example, if someone put us on hold. Probably should have said that at the beginning. Let's see.
Kelsey, you should be able to talk now.
There we go. I was talking ahead. Okay, so thank you, everyone. So those are great. I'm seeing some identifiers go into the chat box, which is fantastic. There are great examples. We've got family, German heritage, church, Lutheran. If I did my own, I might be, I'll type these in right now, but I'm thinking, 3 out of the 5, Native American, woman, life learner. So these are different types of associations that we have about being a part of different groups. So it's really interesting as we start to think about how we identify culturally with the groups that surround us. So going back to some of your definitions, if we look at what scholars have said about what is culture, it's a set of attitudes, values, beliefs, symbols, and behaviors for each individual and usually communicated from one generation to the next. And I think that that's really impactful in terms of what you all shared. You shared examples around religion and values and beliefs and community and behavior. But that added component that there is this generational context. And I think that that's really important when we think about systems of care, because it really is about that connection, that generational connection between youth and family, as well as that partnership connection that is informed by our generational context of how we deliver care. Another item I like to share as we think about how to conceptualize what is culture is the cultural iceberg. If you've taken any type of trauma-informed training before, you may have seen a similar iceberg, but within a trauma-informed care conceptualization. But this is how we think about culture. From a CLC's perspective, we like to share the iceberg, or at least it's one way to think about culture. There are a lot of things for us as individuals, but also as communities that sit above the surface. And these are things, because they sit above the surface, that may be readily apparent to those who are coming into first contact with us, meeting us for the first time, experiencing our communities for the first time. And those generally are things like race or our behaviors, the way we act, language, even potentially our gender. But then there are other things that maybe sit kind of right at the surface, like style, and things that sit beneath the surface, like age, our values, our different abilities, our life experiences, our philosophies and worldviews. And then again, even some of those more individualized aspects of our culture that aren't really readily apparent on first perception. And so I think that this is a really great way of visualizing the concept of culture and just how broad it really is. Because I think sometimes when people think of cultural and linguistic competency, and even sort of why we're doing this series, they think that it's just based on race and ethnicity, that we're trying to resolve conflicts or issues pertaining to those two categories. And in part, yes, those are definitely very prevalent issues in terms of how race and ethnicity lead to different types of disparities or inform different types of disparities within our systems. But as you can see from the iceberg, and as you probably can see even from your own 5 identifiers that you put in the circles, culture is so much broader than that. And that's really how we try and engage with cultural and linguistic competency within system of cares. It's to meet you where you locally are and to adapt to that local environment, that individualized environment of the youth and the family that you may be working with and for. So for those of you that, as this is our sort of kickoff webinar for our series, we wanted to just introduce you to some foundational concepts within CLC. Firstly, what is cultural competence? Well, there's individual and organizational levels. At the individual level, it's the state of being capable of functioning effectively in the context of cultural differences. At the organizational level, it's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in our systems or agencies or among us as professionals to make sure that the system and the professionals that we work with can work effectively in the cross-cultural situations that come before us on a daily basis and quite frequently. But there are also aspects of cultural competency that are informed by historical experiences of prejudice, discrimination, racism, and even everyday implicit and unconscious bias, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, there's also a bit of a movement happening within national conversations with SAMHSA and national conversations around cultural and linguistic competency to change the language a bit. And we're in that transition phase. So I really want to just caution everyone that this is something that's emerging, that cultural competency, that exact phrase, may not be the only level of work in this field. And so how we're starting to see that work transform is to be culturally responsive. That's kind of the new terminology that's emerging. And there are new definitions that are constituting that level of cultural responsiveness. So, and in future webinars, we'll be talking a little bit also about the difference between cultural competence, cultural humility, and cultural responsiveness. So if those are things that you really are intrigued by and want to see the evolution of the practice and the field, we encourage you to tune in for some of our future webinars in March and May. But when we do think about cultural and linguistic competence, people usually focus a lot on the cultural aspect, but they forget the linguistic aspect. And we really want to make sure that you are prepared with a definition of linguistic competence. And it's the capacity of an organization and its personnel to communicate effectively and convey information in a manner that is easily understood by diverse audiences, including persons of limited English proficiency, those who have low literacy skills or are not literate, and individuals with disabilities. And I think one of the things that I really want to highlight here is that competency, many people often, in the same way that they associate culture with only race and ethnicity, associate linguistic competency only with individuals of limited English proficiency. But in fact, it's so much broader than that because of the aspect around literacy skills, as well as different ability levels. So this is also where we are working to be as culturally and linguistically responsive to individuals that may have any type of hearing or vision impairment, as well as individuals who have different literacy levels. Health literacy is also very important. Sometimes we may have gone through college or even gone through high school, but some of the terminology that's used in mental health and behavioral health care is so foreign and unfamiliar to individuals of differing backgrounds that we have to be conscious of those needs as well to be linguistically competent and responsive to them. So I'm just wanting to pause there to also remind people that if they have any questions, they can post questions in the chat box, as well as if you're just signing on and you haven't put your name or your affiliation in the conversation chat box, please do so. If you're new to Skype and you're unsure where that is, it's the little sort of message button. It looks like a little comment bubble box with for those on a PC, it has a circle around it. I'm not using a Mac, so I'm not sure what it looks like on there, but I hope you're finding it just fine. So one of the other things that we want to share with you is, now that you sort of understand cultural and linguistic competency from sort of the most foundational aspects of the field, we now are trying to transition to understanding probably what brought you all here around unconscious bias and implicit bias. And we kind of find that unconscious bias and implicit bias, they allow for these potential areas of what we call, or what I call, a cultural bump. It's concepts of mental health, healing, and help seeking and wellness belief systems. So really, cultural bumps are the understanding that we have different concepts based on the cultures that we come from around mental health. What constitutes healing? What constitutes wellness? What does it mean to be sick? Differs from culture to culture. Sickness in many ways is socially constructed. And so if we aren't cognizant of that, if we don't understand that the way that we view wellness and the way that we may view health as an individual may be different from someone else, then that's where a cultural bump can arise. Perceptions and explanations of the causes of problems with emotions, mental states, and behaviors in children and families also differ based on our cultural backgrounds. Behavior and coping strategies of family members and their attitudes and expectations of professional helpers also differs based on our cultural backgrounds. And so if we're not cognizant of these differences, that's where we sometimes have these cultural bumps or hiccups that can also manifest into larger aspects of problems within the systems, discriminatory practices, etc. And so lastly, sometimes even our service delivery structure and process may not be congruent with the community's preferences or the communities that we're serving, because sometimes the structures and the process by which care is delivered was designed from a different cultural background than the cultures that they're serving. And you may have other examples of your own. So as we start to think about what constitutes prejudice and bias in our systems, we have to start with first off with a question about how do we learn prejudice? I don't think humans, are just innately born with prejudice. Social scientists believe children begin to acquire prejudices and stereotypes as toddlers, and many studies have shown that as early as age 3, children pick up terms of racial prejudice without really understanding their significance. Furthermore, we then have to ask ourselves, well, how are these biases then reinforced? Maybe children could be unlearning them at some point in their life. Well, once learned, stereotypes and prejudices often resist change, even when evidence fails to support them or points to the contrary. And I think you could probably point to a lot of instances in your own life, in contemporary politics, where a lot of these things are very applicable. So sometimes what we also notice is that people will embrace anecdotes that reinforce their biases, but disregard experience that contradicts them. So the statement, "some of my best friends are fill in the blank," captures this tendency to allow some exceptions without changing our bias. So we can still express bias, even though we are providing some type of evidentiary statement to counter someone's perception of our bias. How do we perpetuate bias? Well, it's perpetuated by conformity with in-group attitudes. So again, it's really important that we understand sort of those 5 individual group categories that we placed ourselves in the circles at the beginning of the presentation, because they do inform how we formulate bias in our everyday lives, because those are our affiliations. Those are the cultures that have informed our worldview and our belief system. Sometimes the fact that white culture is dominant in America may explain why people of color often do not show a strong bias favoring their own ethnic group. And this is from some of the scholarly studies that have been done. So if we think about then how bias can impact behavior, well, there's a bit about hidden bias. Sometimes hidden bias can be used interchangeably with unconscious and implicit bias. Scientific research has demonstrated that biases thought to be absent or extinguished remain as mental residue in most of us. Studies show people can be consciously committed to egalitarianism, women's rights, racial equality, and deliberately work to behave without prejudice, yet still possess hidden negative prejudices or stereotypes. Biases and behavior. So a growing number of studies show a link between hidden biases and actual behavior. So in other words, hidden biases can reveal themselves in action, especially when a person's efforts to control behavior consciously flags under stress, distraction, relaxation, or competition. I think sometimes competition is one that you may have had personal experiences with, where that just, people get very excited, the adrenaline's going, And sometimes that's when other sort of these hidden biases or unconscious biases emerge. Well, then this doesn't sound all bad. Well, and it's not. I think that's a big takeaway. Bias is not necessarily always a bad thing, and it is potentially something that we all have, we all carry with us. It's how we react to it and how we understand these hidden biases or unconscious biases that we may have, and how we adapt to them to hopefully not lead to discrimination. So in the instances where we do see discrimination, whether laboratory studies adequately reflect real-life situations is not firmly established. But there's growing evidence, according to social scientists and their studies, that hidden biases are related to discriminatory behavior in a wide range of human interactions, from hiring and promotions to choices of housing and schools. So potentially, it's the unawareness of these hidden biases, these unconscious biases that are leading to a lot of the discriminatory structural practices within our world, and potentially within more narrowly focused within healthcare and mental and behavioral health and systems of care within our systems. So the effects of prejudice and stereotypes, well, these biases have emerged as an important clue to the disparity between public opinion as expressed by America's creed and social goals, and the amount of discrimination that still exists. So when we start to see some of the health disparities within our systems, an overrepresentation of certain youth in the systems compared to their demographic representation overall in communities, that can be an example of some of the larger leading discriminatory practices and prejudice and stereotypes that are emerging because of hidden bias. So this also is where a new term emerged, where we can see racism without racist. And what this means is that implicit bias describes the automatic association people make between groups of people and stereotypes about those groups. Our brains, naturally, biologically, we associate when we see things into categories. It just helps us process the world. And we also do that with people. But under certain conditions, these automatic associations can then also influence our behavior, making us respond in biased ways, even when we are not prejudiced explicitly. So more than 30 years of research in neurology and social and cognitive psychology has shown that people hold implicit biases even in the absence of heartfelt bigotry, simply by paying attention to the social world around them. So again, that's where we find this term when we think about implicit racial bias has given rise to a phenomenon known as racism without racists, which can cause institutions or individuals to act on racial prejudices even in spite of good intentions and non-discriminatory policies or standards. And I think that's really important for understanding how we advance systems of care, how we really create sustainable change, is that articulating implicit bias, articulating instances of hidden or unconscious bias in our systems is not necessarily labeling everyone as racist or the systems as being racist. What it is saying is that there are unconscious hidden biases that are informing our behavior and creating discriminatory policies and standards and impacts and disparate impacts on a wide variety of youth and families and individuals throughout our systems. And it's not just based on race. It's based on all the different ways that we categorize people through our unconscious biases, and then that is informing our behavior towards them. So it could be based on economics, it could be based on religion, it could be based on their skin color, it could be based on the way that they talk and their speech. So there's a lot of things that come into play here. So a key takeaway is that everyone has implicit bias. This is some potential preference we have for a group, positive or negative. Often we operate it operates outside our awareness. So implicit bias is occurring, we have implicit bias, but we're just not aware of it. It can be based on stereotypes and attitudes that we hold. We develop it early in life, as the study's shown. Usually, the toddler age is very formative in the establishment of these biases, and they tend to strengthen over time. And for your reference, when we talk about attitudes or stereotypes, attitudes are the evaluative feelings that are positive or negative, and stereotypes are traits we associate with a category. So further exploration of how does implicit bias show itself in our everyday lives? Well, if we think about when a provider has a pro-white implicit bias, maybe that's from their upbringing, maybe they identify with that category. There's a lot of reasons that there could be a pro-white implicit bias. You can even have someone who's non-white have a pro-white implicit bias because of how they were socialized at an early age as a toddler. But let's say a provider has a pro-white implicit bias. Interactions with non-white youth and families are categorized by higher verbal dominance, slower speech, and less positive effect when compared with interactions with white youth or families. There can be less involvement of the youth and families in decisions, and that can be for a multitude of reasons, for however they view that non-white category. Maybe they don't view them as being able to make decisions for themselves. There's a lot of reasons that could go behind that. And it's individualized to that person's implicit bias. And there also could be less youth or family centeredness in interactions. When we think about the youth family outcomes, like how are they then perceiving a provider that has a pro-white implicit bias? There's less satisfaction with their care, with their visit. Sometimes there's non-adherence to any type of plan that's been developed because they don't feel that there was ownership of it. They weren't involved to begin with. They weren't allowed to make decisions about their care. And a lower trust and confidence in the provider because they just didn't respect them. And we'll talk a lot later about how trust and respect are connected. So I want to try and show a film. Hopefully it will work. Mark, if you don't hear anything and it's not coming through, if you could let me know, that would be great. But please watch the film, and we're just going to try and identify aspects of unconscious bias that we see in this short film. So if you can watch it for that.
Kelsey, it looks like there's a little bit of a lag with the video.
Okay, let's see if we restart it. And thank you for bearing with us, everyone. This is the first time trying a video the program. So I hope the film, I guess it might have been a little delayed. I hope it came through somewhat well. So that was a TED Talk short film that was put together on unconscious bias. And I'm curious if the audio was a little delayed, hopefully the captioning came through. What are your thoughts? And I don't know, I think maybe we can do thoughts in the chat box, Mark, or if we could open the lines for people to, if they want to join in conversation. But I'm curious to see how you react in terms of what did you notice within the film around unconscious bias? The audience is now unmuted, so everyone can, if you'd like to speak, just unmute yourself and you're welcome to add your thoughts.
Hi, it's Larissa Kimmel. Definitely what I saw is this young man at a very young age was identified by teachers as, being disruptive and not really taking time to find out what was going on with him. And he became labeled as time went on, which then pushed him to some really high risk behaviors.
Yes, yes. And so that's something that we are definitely concerned with. And I think that it really shows how unconscious bias can manifest in our schools and really affect children. So when we think about the different systems that come together for system of care, I thought that this one video shows one example of just how much our unconscious or implicit bias, when it is negatively driven, can have a ripple effect. And that's a really big part of these conversations is the ripple effect of that initial confrontation, that initial behavior towards that young person that was informed by an implicit bias. And we saw at the end of the film that African American and Latino students are more likely to be disciplined in school than their white counterparts. And usually for the same types of behavior. So it really does bring us to this question of why does that disparity exist? Is there a connection to unconscious or implicit bias? And studies have shown that there are. Now, every case is different and every context is different, but it does make us need to challenge and ask those questions about why are these biases emerging still very persistent within our societies. We had someone also mention that the adults were very negative toward the youth. So again, there can be bias that's very positive, but this bias was definitely very, very negative. So thank you for sharing in those thoughts. We've got another one that we're going to watch. I will just play it for a little bit and then restart it because I think that might have helped a bit with the time lapse. And hopefully it's not too bad. Start it again. And this short film was put together by Broward County System of Care, and we'll talk a little bit more about that after. Okay, so that was the video on I Deserve Respect. Again, if we are, I don't know if the audience is still unmuted, but if they can be unmuted, no audio. Okay, did the audio come through eventually for anyone? Mark, did you have it?
No, I didn't have the audio.
Seeing a lot of no's. Okay. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, we can always share those videos afterwards, and we can share it on another email blast out with the video links.
Did the audio work for the first one, for the youth? It did?
No.
No. Okay, so it was just the captioning. Okay, so maybe we'll try and have the captioning for the others. And thanks for bearing with us, everyone. We will try and figure out the video technology at a later point. What you may have been able to see it through the visuals, but not the audio. It was a scene that basically described a mother going to sit with a provider to start the intake process for their child. And in doing that, the provider, in the review of her file, was very dismissive, was not listening to her, and was just very disrespectful. And so, one of the questions, posed to us after the video is, how did you see unconscious bias manifest in the video? And one of the clear ways is that the provider clearly had some type of implicit bias towards single moms, definitely had an implicit bias towards women who had many children. In the video, the mother says that she has 5 girls. The provider also then asked her, are they all by the same father? So it was very much expressing a bias towards her in terms of her children and their parentage. And it really impacted the way in which he behaved towards her and the ultimate delivery of care. But one of the key things that was also pointed out in the video, and why we're talking about addressing unconscious bias in systems of care, are the class standards. So it's not just about saying, okay, unconscious bias exists, implicit bias exists, these hidden biases exist, so there's nothing we can do about it. Well, no, there actually are things that we can do about it, and there are principles within system of care that say that this should not be a standard of care delivery. In fact, the class standards set out a much higher delivery of care standard across the board. And the one that was pointed out in the video there was the class standard 1, which says that care needs to be delivered respectfully. So if you are not respecting families and their cultural backgrounds and the diversity that they bring within their lived experience, then that is not in line with the national class standards. But oftentimes people get confused between what is CLC and what is class. So class, these are culturally, linguistically appropriate services. That's what class stands for. It expands upon the definition of CLC. Class is another way to think about CLC. Class was developed by the Office of Minority Health, and it's a framework for how do we put CLC into operation, how do we mobilize it. And the class standards are also seen as the blueprint for implementing culturally and linguistically appropriate services. They've also evolved over the years, and I think they're on that path towards evolving more, as I mentioned earlier, from that competency understanding to more of responsiveness and humility. But we saw when they first emerged in 2000, culture was defined in very rigid terms around race, ethnicity, and linguistics. So if for any reason that's what you thought CLC was before coming to this presentation, oh, it's about race, it's about ethnicity, it's about people who are non-English speakers, then you probably may have sort of been indoctrinated with a bit of that viewpoint when the national class standards came out in 2000 and from general dissemination of information and materials around this topic. But since then, we've evolved in so many ways. Our society has changed in so many ways. And so the class standards were revised in 2013, and you can see that culture now has a much broader definition. It is thought of in terms of race, ethnicity, linguistic groups, but also geography, religion, spirituality, biological and other sociological characteristics. And even within those sociological characteristics are economic characteristics. And within that too, the audience for the national class standards has expanded. The definitions of how we understand health has been expanded. And it is more centered on the individuals and the communities that are receiving care. So it seems like the videos aren't working very well. So we will share the links with you, and I probably won't play them. But I really would encourage you to see, to go back and link and see all of them. This one, I Am Farzana. It's about now a young woman, but at the time she was in elementary school. She lives in New York City when 9/11 happened. She's of a Muslim background. She's a practicing Muslim. Her family were practicing Muslims. And it's about how she had to deal with Islamophobia and implicit and unconscious bias in the aftermath of 9/11, and the way in which people took that event and the bias they had because of that event, that learned bias, and then stereotyped and were prejudicial and discriminatory towards her. And it then really impacted her mental health. She was further diagnosed after that point in her life with depression and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so she talks a little bit about how she is recovering and is on her mental health journey. And it's really impactful, I think, to understand that unconscious bias, implicit bias, they're not just words that people tell you in a training like today or on a webinar, but that they have real lived impacts every day in all of our lives. So a big part of what we saw in some of the films are what we think about in terms of how implicit bias and unconscious bias are enacted through behaviors in terms of negative behaviors. If they are negative behaviors and they're somewhat on a small scale, but they're consistent, we call them microaggressions. We're going to have our webinar in May. We'll look at this in the context of social media and our online worlds, but we wanted to introduce you to the concept today. It can be a question, a comment, even an unintended compliment, even an intended compliment sometimes that nevertheless suggests something demeaning. We see this, some examples of this are if a white person asks an Asian American where they are from, conveying the message that they are perpetually foreigners in their own land. We see this in other instances of immigrant American populations in the United States. Another example is telling a person of color that he or she is so articulate, which implies that all other people of that color or of that cultural background are not, that they're somehow an anomaly. And then another example is, you're not like those other women, gays, lesbians, blacks, Latinos, that I've met, etc. This implies that the person is an exception, and that somehow you're then associating the rest of their majority grouping with some type of negative or demeaning connotation. Again, this is another video. You can go to StoryCorps. So I hope that today our recording of the training will be available. The PowerPoint will be available. We'll link you to the videos so you can watch them. But StoryCorps is also a great resource if you're looking for short videos to try and convey some of the very challenging topics we have in our world today, and especially within cultural and linguistic competency. But this one's called Facundo the Great. It talks about some of the microaggressions that occurred in a small farming town in California towards Mexican American children whose names were not English sounding. And all of the school professors and teachers at this school in this farming community would change the students' names. So instead of calling someone Ramon, they would say, "Oh, you're Raymond." And instead of calling someone Jacinta, they would say, "Oh, you're Jane." And they constantly would do this to students. And then one day, the student named Facundo arrived, and they were trying to figure out how to shorten his name. And they said, oh, well, maybe if we just shorten it to FAC. And then all the teachers said, well, that would just say Fock, and we can't go around calling him Fock. Where's your homework? And so it's a little bit on the humorous side, but then Facundo comes out very, glorious in that he gets to keep his name. All the teachers at the school are forced to use his real name. And so the other students there really, that was a very memorable story for them. And StoryCorps, these are all real life stories that they then make into animations and bring to life. So this was a real life experience of a Mexican American during his life growing up. And I think it really is very much emblematic, symbolic of what we're talking about when we think about microaggressions. It's the same, it can be very much replicated in other instances. So whether someone has what might be termed a non-English name, and people don't honor that name. So even a mispronunciation of the name on a repetitive basis is a microaggression. So instead of saying Mariana, they say Mary Anna, making it very much bastardized in terms of what that person's name actually is. Another way that we see this manifest in terms of names and just individual understandings of people are preferred pronouns, as well as someone who may be transgender, and maybe they have transitioned and also taken on a different name, and they want you to use that name, but you do not. And that is a form of microaggression, which is informed by implicit bias and unconscious bias. Can be. If it becomes repetitive, then it varies to the point of not necessarily being unconscious, if you become aware that you are consistently doing it purposefully. So we now are transitioning to the part where I hope we haven't left you too much with a negative mindset. I mean, implicit bias, hidden bias, yes, it is very negative and it's hard to deal with these challenges, but we can. It's about changing sort of maybe what our minds are telling us and our hearts, and connecting them more. Because right now, when we see implicit bias have a negative impact on youth and families and system of care, it's because our minds and hearts are disconnected. So we can work through using our minds for better and effective communication. So we need to improve that requires us to have empathy and to be willing to listen to others' concerns about the system, about their care delivery, even just about how they are feeling in terms of their mental and behavioral health. That allows us to manage unconscious bias. So again, these non-conscious attitudes, beliefs that are readily apparent to individuals, they can vary from person to person, and they result in the prejudice and discrimination that we see in our systems. So again, this is reiterating that we are working towards trying to formulate a reciprocal relationship within systems of care between system partners, families, youths. We really want there to be an established reciprocal relationship of trust and respect. So how do we put this into action, or where do we see some of the manifestations of there being problems and potentially, things working out well? Well, we think about listening and attention, being able to listen and be attentive versus dismissing. Youth and families say, you're listening to what I'm saying to you, not just hearing. There's a big difference between listening and hearing somebody. You can hear a noise and not pay attention to it, but if you listen to it, you can figure out what it is. So that's what I want them to do. Listen to what I'm saying. And I think that's really indicative of how we can start to transition away from the negative impacts of bias to being more positive, to making sure that we are being good listeners and attentive. Being known as an individual, start to know people as individuals, understand their unique and individualized cultural backgrounds. When they come in, they know who I am and, what was going on. They remember the last visit that we had. So that level of attention to detail even, and really being individualized to the youth and family is important. We also, youth and families remember when they're treated rudely versus politely. My button was pushed by the little snippy girl at the counter. So we have to think about our frontline staff as well, and how they interact with youth and family partners, how they are representing your organization, how they are representing the system. They really are. They're not called frontline staff for no reason. They're called that because they are. They're the first impression that youth and family members receive related to what type of care they're going to see from the system. Also handling lateness, how lateness is handled. Lateness is very culturally informed, and so you need to be conscious of it from your own bias, whether that be positive or negative, how you understand lateness. And you also need to understand that from the youth and families perspective. It gets to the point where, I get so upset. That can hurt you too, because it seems like they ain't caring, about my time anymore. So if you're someone who is perpetually late and that's not something that's culturally acceptable with the youth and family that you're working with, you really could be doing a disservice to building that reciprocal relationship of respect and trust. And then trusting self-knowledge. That's something that we can be working towards to counteract any implicit bias that we may have. And how we see this enacted is one youth family member said, we know, like I said, we know what's wrong with us. We know what's hurting, whether they want to believe it or not, So one of the things there is that we need to empower youth and families to acknowledge that and trust their knowledge of themselves and how their bodies are feeling, how they understand their mental health, and really allow for that to exist in a safe space for that reciprocal relationship of trust and respect to be able to be formed properly. So when we sort of transition from microaggressions, we can also have micro affirmations. This can allow for us to change unconscious biases in our systems. Micro affirmations, they can be subtle or apparently small acknowledgments of a person's value and accomplishments. They may take the shape of public recognition of the person, opening a door, referring positively to the work of a person, commending someone on the spot, or making a happy introduction. Even more than that, micro affirmations don't have to just be individualized. Micro affirmations can also be community-based. So if there are a lot of communities that you're working with, or if you seem to have some type of implicit bias to one community over another, work to try and affirm that other community that maybe you don't do that as often with. So debiasing, or the process of trying to change our unconscious biases, there's usually 3 different pillars that you can work towards to debias. They involve education, exposure, and approach. So within education, it's about contact, being positive exemplars. It's about understanding your environment. So really building your knowledge of the communities and the youth and families that you are working for and with. Exposure is around awareness and mindfulness, so being more aware of your bias, and then more mindful of how you can work to change that bias, or at least to make sure that that bias is not impacting your behavior towards someone in a negative manner. And then lastly, approach will go more into detail around this topic, but it's about understanding a higher level of processing, reducing your cognitive load, and sometimes creating checklists or procedural and organizational changes. I'll go more into detail with that because it may seem kind of vague right now. So again, when we think about education, it also relates to awareness and mindfulness. So be aware and remain mindful. Intuition and implicit responses are valuable, but some decisions require a more explicit kind of thinking. I think those actually may have been switched around. Apologies for that. So education should be here, which is make contact with positive, diverse colleagues, cultural brokers, communities, and exemplars, and practice taking the other perspective. All contribute to decreasing implicitly biased responses. So if we think about how do we educate ourselves more, it's about going out into the communities that we serve. It's about connecting with them. Even from a youth and family perspective, you know, this may be your first time interacting with a system. It may be that you need to find family support partners or peer support partners to help you navigate. You know, we all have implicit bias. So education is really about how do we make better contacts, find positive exemplars or mentors that can help us navigate the systems, and take a different perspective than one that we normally would take. So even for youth and families, maybe, you know, take the perspective of the systems that you're working with. See where they might try to be coming from. Take the perspective of another youth or family in a similar situation to yours. And again, from a system perspective, really try and take the perspective of youth and families in their interaction with your agency or organization. And then so this one would be exposure. And exposure is about building your awareness and mindfulness of your implicit biases. It's again that higher level processing, reducing cognitive loads, making, you know, slowing down the pace by which you make decisions so you're not making a decision that adversely impacts a certain population. This can help by developing checklists and certain policies and procedural organizational changes. It also is about micro messaging. So ensuring that the types of messaging and communication you're putting out to the community is respectful of the diversity and the beauty of differences that are present in those communities. So when we think about using checklists, so sometimes if you're someone who potentially has enacted negative behaviors because of your bias, think about developing a checklist that counteracts some of those negative behaviors. Something that if you're a frontline worker that you use every time you're greeting a guest, so that you know that your standard of care or your standard of interaction with those guests is standardized across the board. If you're someone who is doing intakes, maybe you have a checklist for how you conduct an intake to make sure that you are treating everyone equally, that you are responsive to everyone's unique cultural backgrounds. You can also write out some of your statements and how you might ask questions. Practice asking questions in advance, maybe with your team, with other staff, so that they can give you feedback on whether or not they think you're being offhanded or discriminatory in your language and in your delivery. And then sometimes you can have CLC specific tools. So maybe you already have a practice, like an evidence-based practice program or some other type of way in which you connect and interact with youth and families that's already standardized, right? It comes from someone maybe at the national level or at the state level or at your county level, and it's just been given to you as, well, this is how we collect information. This is how we have conversations. But you can always adapt those tools. You can always make a CLC specific tool to make sure that in addition to doing all of those things that are required by the state, the feds, or the county level, that maybe you also just have an additional layer of added CLC tools that allow you to ensure that you're being as responsive linguistically and culturally as you can be. So you also can look in terms of the approach section about how to change procedural and organizational components. It could be around staffing, as you see in the example to the left, and you can make a plan. So I have here, like, do you have a cultural and linguistic competency plan that details how you're going to deal with implicit or unconscious bias. Maybe it's about, on the education level, maybe it's providing trainings, maybe it's making sure that staff do self-assessments on a yearly or biannual basis. Maybe it's that you recruit more diverse staff and you stagger things in year after year. What you're going to come to realize is that cultural and linguistic competency, it's not a checklist. It is a checklist can be a part of what you put forward for it, but it itself is not a checklist. It's a journey. There is a lot to do, and you can always be improving your CLC programming and policy work. And so, yeah, do you have a CLC plan? Do you have a mission statement? How do you hold people accountable if they if they've acted inappropriately because of their bias? Are there places for grievances to be laid? I mean, the national class standards say that youth and families should have a form for grievance and a process for a grievance claim if the class standards are not being met. And so these are things to consider. There's also things around your messaging and environment. Small messages can be affirming or inequitable. Does anyone notice anything about the pictures on this slide? You can type it into the chat box. Do we still have everyone, Mark?
I believe so. We had a little glitch with the webinar series, and it looks like I have control of the slides for some reason. Don't know why, okay, but I'm caught up now.
Okay. Sorry, everyone. I guess technology is not being our friend today. So if you're caught up now and you see this slide that has these pictures in front of it, and it says, notice your messaging and environment. Small messages can be affirming or inequitable. Is there anything that you notice about the slides, and can you type that into the chat box?
Yeah, right now they have all statues. It looks like male statues, historical white figures.
Great. Okay. And so maybe, Mark, if it's fine, I'll just leave you with the slide control, and I'll just say next slide. So what you do notice from the previous slide is that, yes, there are all white male statues. There are some women there. Some of them are standing behind men in the top right. That's correct. And so I'm not saying that maybe all of your provider offices look like that, but the question I have for you is, when's the last time you had someone come in with fresh eyes to say, what do our office spaces look like? What does it look like for youth and families that are coming for the first time to see our, to see us, to come to this space for care? Are they welcoming environments? So our messaging can also be indicative of our implicit bias. And so sometimes, our lighting, the signage we have around, the posters, if you're unfamiliar with the Safe Zone project, they have a lot of posters and stickers that you can utilize for free that indicate to people from the LGBTQ community that that your office or your space that they're coming to is a safe space for them. Also, similarly, think about, we just sort of passed the holiday time. If you had tons of holiday decorations that were only affiliated with Christmas, maybe that's also indicative of some implicit bias that we hold. And that's not to say that Christmas is a bad thing in any sort of way, but it's to have you ask yourself, okay, your implicit bias said Christmas is great, it's positive, it's a part of my culture and how I identify, and so I want to decorate. But did you then connect that potential implicit bias with another sort of mind matter question of, oh, this is leading to a behavior where I decorate my office with all Christmas things. Do I also have it within me to have a behavior of asking, can we have decorations for Hanukkah and decorations for Kwanzaa, and maybe no decorations at all, so that we are inclusive of everyone. But it's about having those courageous conversations with others. Next slide. So leading into getting to sort of some concluding thoughts for the presentation, and then allowing some time for questions. How do we acquire cultural competence? Well, we need to recognize the broad dimensions of culture, respect youth and families as the primary source for defining needs and priorities, and increase sensitivity to alienating behaviors. Next slide. So again, cultural competency, CLC, these are ongoing processes. It implies the ability to take action, to adapt, and to function in different environments, but it's also not just about one-time action. It's about sustained commitment. It's a developmental process, not something that can be a checkbox. And so elements can be integrated into all aspects of your programming, your care delivery, even the plans that you develop for the individualized plans for youth and families. They can have CLC built right in. And there are great examples of that. And you're welcome to email us at the end if you'd like some of those resources and tools. And some of them are available on our PAK partnership website. Next slide. So hopefully, as you're going through a lot of this information and in our conversations, you've really started to see that there are strengths to cultural diversity. Implicit bias, again, it's not always a bad thing, but when it manifests itself in negative behaviors, it works to dismantle some of the strengths that we're trying to build around cultural diversity. Cultural diversity offers an environment of inclusion that is supportive of collaboration, and it increases productivity and loyalty. It promotes equality and equal opportunity. It encourages interactions of diverse people. It can foster respect and prepare community members to live and work in a competitive economy, right? So if we start to think about some of the manifestations of bias in our world and how they lead to discriminatory practices, even the young boy in the earlier video, I know you couldn't hear the sound, but you could see some of the captioning. We really could see how that first initial interaction had a ripple effect for the rest of his life. And so if we start to think about that within systems of care, within the systems that youth and families are interacting with, if we really make sure that their initial interactions and that implicit bias is not impacting their day-to-day experiences, we are preparing them to be more competitive in our overall society, and that's and to be their best selves as they see fit, and to really have ownership over that process and over their lives. Next slide. So again, just reaffirming what we've learned in terms of what is cultural competence. It's a set of behaviors and attitudes that professionals use to understand our own values and culture, to value diversity and cultural differences, and to adapt to the culture of the family or the communities that we are working and serving. And it also is about effectively working in cross-cultural situations. And there's a link there that will allow you to click on additional tips for how to address or de-bias yourselves and just enhance your overall cultural responsiveness. Next slide. So as you start to undertake this journey and work towards combating some of your implicit biases, you're going to be building skills that include being aware of your own culture and values. You already did that today by filling out the 5 circles, and maybe you hadn't really asked yourself that before. What are 5 groups that you strongly identify with? You're respecting differences. You're being aware of and working at controlling your own biases and how they affect your interactions with others. Because sometimes we're just not even aware of it. That's why it's implicit or unconscious. Understanding institutional barriers. I hope today you also came away with a greater understanding, and if you are able to go and watch those videos, I think you'll come away with an even greater understanding of how implicit bias can actually lead, it compounds and it grows exponentially when people aren't addressing it, and it can lead to some of the institutional barriers and the systemic structural barriers that we see in our society today, and specifically within mental health and behavioral health care, that have led to the disparate impacts of certain populations having overrepresentation or even underrepresentation in care delivery. We also hope that through this work, when we start to de-bias ourselves, we are working towards building those stronger cross-cultural relationships that are founded on trust and respect. It leads us to be better advocates for youth and families that we're working for. And so for cultural competency, it can help us to address disparities and disproportionalities. We sometimes see that because of these issues, there's this overrepresentation. There's a less likely that those who are overrepresented or sometimes underrepresented based on their demographics are less likely to receive needed services. Furthermore, we see that there is an overrepresentation sometimes in special education classes and restrictive levels of care. So RTFs, for example, we've seen that especially within Pennsylvania, that there can be overrepresentation of certain populations. So ultimately, these are all the things that really are massive things. When we think about cultural and linguistic competency, these are big systemic structural barriers within our systems of care. But I hope what you come away from today with is understanding that they start small. They often are informed by the implicit biases that we all carry. And so we all have a role in trying to dismantle them and work towards sustainable change and better care delivery for all and equality for all in the way in which mental and behavioral health care is delivered and received. Next slide. And a big part of that is learning to communicate better. We have to learn culturally specific information. One of the great ways to, especially if some of your implicit bias has to do with linguistic competency, try and work towards educating yourself again by learning some words and phrases that are in the family or youth language, especially that's not just if their language is not English, but also if you have any type of different levels of abilities, different types of vision or hearing impairments. Really work to meet the youth and families where they are at and where their cultural background comes from. I've heard great examples of doing this as well in terms of health literacy by, instead of using lots of forms and other types of paperwork, providers and system partners will adapt the process to allow for pictures and different types of imagery and maybe even sound that allows for different types of learners, different types of engagement with language and communication that works more effectively and is tailored to that youth and family. Next slide. So again, a lot of this also, we did talk about the individual, but I do want you to think about how you can encourage this work at the structural and system level. So encouraging for more plans to be developed. If there should be a CLC plan and or incorporate that CLC plan into the larger strategic plan of your organization, your county government, and we've even done that at the state level, and at the federal level, they have the national class standards. So again, try and replicate this good behavior as best as possible. Think about, your mission statements, the materials that you have, are they available in other languages? How are you connecting and being responsive to the communities that you serve to build that reciprocal relationship? If you lead with these types of competent system and responsive system initiatives, then the communities are going to trust you more, and youth and families are going to be able to have a better access to care. Next slide. So again, this is about a commitment to change, an overall commitment to changing our decision-making processes to include youth and families and community. It's about a commitment to structural and policy changes that support cultural diversity and making policies and practices more fluid so that we can accommodate all of the necessary adjustments, whether that be a linguistic adjustment or a cultural adjustment. We need to be able to be adaptive and responsive. Next slide. So again, moving you towards your cultural competency, I think you'll have to hit a few buttons to get this one to progress, Mark. Attitudes must change. Policies must change and practices must become more congruent. We must start to really make sure that the systems reflect the communities they're serving and not the other way around. Next slide. We have to value diversity in this process, which is about creating environments, understanding our messaging, making sure that we are creating safe and welcoming spaces. You can also do this by hosting events. Sometimes if you are noticing either as an individual or as an organization that you see the implicit bias is really having a negative impact on your delivery of care, your reciprocal relationships with youth and families, host social events. We've had great success with people hosting community cafes, with doing different types of simulations, with going out and just attending already existing community events and putting up a mental health booth and telling about the services that you offer. Hire staff and leaders who reflect the community that you're serving and the communities that you're serving. That's a big takeaway that we've heard from youth and families is sometimes it is really hard to connect with someone that has no understanding of their background. And then partner with other organizations and institutions that have a lot of the education and knowledge that you're working to build and can really sort of be that stepping stone to get you there. Next slide. So ultimately, we are saying by doing this, by working proactively to try and address some of our biases, we're saying that culture matters. Our culture matters, but also the cultures of other people that we come into contact with. When culture is ignored, families are at risk of not getting the support they need, or worse yet, receiving assistance that is more harmful than helpful. And that really is the case across the board for the videos that we attempted to show today and those stories of those individuals who have experienced a traumatic event, as well as are recovering and on their health journey for their mental health or behavioral health care issue. And so we really are trying to make sure that, you know, people who are already trying to heal don't need us to be inflicting more harm on them. Next slide. So that brings us to the end of our presentation today, about an hour and a half time. And it really is to leave you with this saying, we'll leave you with this every time: cultural competence and linguistic competence are a life's journey, not a destination. So we wish you safe travels, and we'll go to the next slide. We'll allow time for questions. We have a buffer. I'm here to stay on the line for another half an hour even if you need it. But I'd love if there are any questions or things that maybe we didn't talk about today, or if you have personal comments around implicit bias, unconscious bias that you think should be a part of the conversation today, please feel free to share. We'll unmute everyone in the audience, and you also are welcome to type into the chat box.
Well, Kelsey, this is Mark. Thank you for providing the training today and allowing us a couple of technical difficulties that we had. This is our first time using this on a large scale, so we do appreciate it. I did share the link where we'll have this information posted, which is on our PA Care Partnership website. If you go up there and look under training and cultural and linguistic webinar series, we'll have that posted in the next few days. Great job, Kelsey.
Thank you. We've got some people saying much thanks, so thanks to everyone that's adding that. Yeah, and if there's anyone with questions or again comments that you'd like to share, we know that this is a really important topic. We had a lot of people send regrets today, just mentioning that they had some additional conflicts that made it so they couldn't come, but they were really excited that we were starting to talk about this topic. And so we're open to your thoughts and ideas if there's anything that that you'd like to see next time we talk about this topic. Well, Okay, well, not hearing anything. We had a really large participation today, so like Mark said, thank you so much, everyone. We're at that hour-and-a-half mark. Our next sessions are in March and May. The dates were on the announcements, but we'll be sending more announcements out. And so we just encourage you to attend those. They're on the culture of the family, as well as our lives in the age of social media and the microaggressions that can occur from those experiences. And we have one participant who said, we did a bias training last semester. The outcome led some to see change and others to get upset and frustrated. What are some suggestions that you have for next steps to help those who are still upset or not wanting to change? Oh, that's such a really great question. I think it would be to do some, one option would be to do a follow-up training with those individuals that allows, and I would say maybe not so much a training as a focus group that allows them in a safe space to voice some of those concerns. You can structure it with an action item. I think it's always good if people come to a focus group of that nature with to be action oriented. So you can say the focus group is to develop an action plan for addressing our cultural and linguistic competency needs within our organization, or I'm not sure exactly sort of who the training was geared towards. But basically it's to say, you know, we heard your positive critiques as well as your negative critiques from this training we had in the past, and we want to talk them through some more and really develop an action plan to address them and to think about how we could be responsive to your needs as staff, but also to the community's needs. And so I always say with those types of focus groups as well, are to include youth and families if appropriate. What you could also do is if staff just need a safe space to initially voice their concerns, then you can have it just be staff, and then you can have an additional one when you kind of have a draft plan started or a draft action items started, that you maybe host another one that's more open to the community, and it can be an open house type event where people get to go and talk about in small groups the different items that you've put forward. Additionally to that, you could do you could see if maybe bringing in a different trainer that specializes it on one topic allows for it to be more digestible to people. The other thing I say too, and I'm not sure if this was if this trainer in this training expressed that, sometimes, and I think for system of care, the value that we are wanting to convey to people is not to force them to believe in something they don't want to believe in. What we are trying to raise awareness around is that if your beliefs and or implicit bias are going to result in negative behavior that poorly impacts youth or families seeking care, then you need to be able to identify that in advance of that harm being conducted against that youth or family, so that you can remove yourself and allow for another staff or someone else who doesn't have that bias that would then lead to that negative behavior to better serve them and better work with them and build that reciprocal relationship. So I think that's also another big takeaway from today is reciprocal relationships have to be reciprocal. So if for any reason your implicit bias, your bias towards a certain group of people or a certain belief is just, it's very, it's core to who you see yourself as a human being, that's okay. You don't have to change that, but you do have to be able to identify that that is a part of you, and then be able to remove yourself and find someone else who can properly build that reciprocal relationship with the youth and family. I hope that answered your question. Any other questions? Okay. Well, again, I definitely want to thank everyone for coming. I'll say, too, to that last question, self-assessments are great, too, because I think sometimes when people are resistant to change, it's because they feel like the expectation is for them to change overnight, to one day not be accepting of something and then the next day to be accepting of something. And so self-assessment, an assessment tool that you introduce on a yearly basis or every 6 months or a quarterly basis that allows staff to see how they are progressing and evolving as a human being in terms of their belief system and how they're being more responsive or even potentially less responsive to youth and families is a really great tool. It's something that they take ownership of. It doesn't really have to be shared with others. If that you can set it up in so many different ways, and it allows them to track their progress on their own time, and within their own safe space of how to really change. So thank you again to everyone. If you have further questions or you'd like to talk more, I'm available to set up one-on-one meetings if needed, and you can contact me at leonardkt@upmc.edu. That concludes our webinar for today.
Thank you all.